Chapter 20 May 1974 Islamabad Part 1. It was already 4 o'clock, yet the unseasonably hot afternoon in Islamabad had barely cooled. John swallowed the last of his tea and cleaned off his desk, ready to go home. As he climbed into his car, he whispered a short prayer that Marian would be refreshed and happy after a 5-day UN education and observation tour. For the last 7 years, since he had resigned from Livermore, moved back to Los Angeles, and started work for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, life had been calm. In charge of the nuclear safeguard program, he was satisfied with the career move and found the work both challenging and meaningful. Marian finally seemed to have recovered from the miscarriage and had started teaching again. With 2 incomes and no children, they lived a comfortable and pleasant life, enjoying holidays in Europe, trips to museums, and good food. Marian was like a little bird, happy with her uncomplicated existence, sometimes possessive but unpretentious. Her artistic creativity was on full display in their cozy house. Then everything started to unravel again. On a standard review of the PAC-1 file, John found a glaring oversight. The Pakistan nuclear research reactor, supplied by the US government in 1965, had not been inspected in nearly 2 years. According to the contract, the US government was responsible for both maintaining and upgrading the facility. A 2-year interval on a nuclear plant was unthinkable. John immediately reported the lapse to his supervisors, including recommendations for updating the safety policies. To his surprise, the committee instructed him to remedy the situation personally, on site in Islamabad. He had estimated that updating PAC-1 safety procedures would take 6 months. Once he'd arrived and inspected the plant's existing safety practices, however, he realized the job was far more complicated than he had anticipated. Marian quit her teaching job, excited about living in such an exotic location. They found a beautiful furnished house near the city center, convenient for shopping and social activities, and settled in for an extended stay. But the novelty soon wore off, and she retreated into a bored restlessness. To keep her occupied and give her a sense of purpose, John scraped together occasional stints for her as a local UN assistant. The Pakistan Atomic Research Center was located on the south end of Islamabad, a good 40-minute drive from home. The first thing John noticed when he pulled up to the house was that none of the windows were open. He frowned, disappointed to see the house just as he'd left it that morning. Marian loved fresh air, bright rooms, and the potted flowers she hung on the balcony rails. His hands gripped the steering wheel as the excitement of seeing her again drained out of him. Turning the doorknob, he peered inside. Marian lay on the couch, still in her business suit. He eased in and closed the door as gently as possible to avoid waking her. As he tiptoed in, stealthily moving the suitcase out of the way, Marian said, "You're home early." He flinched at her peevish tone. "Yes, I wanted to surprise you." He bent down to kiss her. "Are you okay? You look tired." She didn't answer. Her thick, dark eyelashes lay against her cheeks like drawn curtains, shutting out everything, and her cherry-red lips pouted. He looked at the empty glass, smudged with her lipstick, on the coffee table and tried again. "How about a glass of water, or maybe some juice?" She still didn't speak, only opening her big eyes momentarily to throw a disdainful glance at him. He stood still, unsure how to react. "Do you have any idea what this country is really like?" she asked. "I mean, out on the street, beyond your little bubble of scientists and nerds. It's the most uncivilized country I've ever seen. You don't know what it's like. She sat up, glaring. The society is brimming with discrimination and hatred against women, against the poor, the Indians, and us, especially us. Their society is very different from ours. We have to accept those differences, even, maybe especially, when we don't understand them. You have to be a little more tolerant. She snorted. More tolerant? Haven't I been tolerant enough? For 4 months now? 4 months. I'm sick of being treated like a second-class citizen. She stood up and pointed toward the coffee table. Even when I wear this stupid scarf on my head, I'm still not allowed in some places, just because I'm a woman. But they'll let any man in, no problem. And then they stare at me like I'm an alien or something. The schools we visited this week, how many of them do you suppose allow girls? Not even 10%. This is one of the poorest countries in the world, with one of the lowest literacy rates, because they spend barely 2% on their gross national product on education. But they'll spend 30% on defense without a second thought. Millions of dollars on building your precious nuclear power plants. What they really need is to improve education and raise people's living standards. Not think about bloody nuclear power. Or worse, nuclear bombs. He looked at her, incredulous. Did you say nuclear bombs? Now, who knows what they spend their defense budget on? Could be anything. She slumped back down on the sofa and crossed her arms across her chest defiantly. He'd never heard her rant so passionately about politics before, but her words gave him pause. For the first time he wondered, how important is nuclear power, really, to a poor country like Pakistan? And would the country's leaders be tempted to use the technology to develop nuclear weapons? He stared at her, deep in thought, but she wasn't finished. The worst part is, a teenage boy shouted insults and made rude gestures at me, pointing his fingers like he was going to shoot me. They hate us. Why are we here? Why do we give them so much money? Marian, I'm so sorry. He sat down next to her, his arm going around her shoulders and pulling her close as he ran his fingers through her luxurious curls. Darling, please don't be too upset. Try to calm down. As she huddled against his chest, he felt her shoulders shaking, her tears dampening his shirt. I want to go home, sobbed Marian. She picked up a tissue on the table, blew her nose, and then continued. I just don't understand why you brought me here. I'm sorry, honey. I promise we'll go back soon. When? He hesitated, unwilling to commit. Well, you always say that. This time I mean it. If you don't take me home, I'm going back myself. She tried to squirm out of his embrace. John cradled her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. Okay, we'll leave in June. By the end of June, I promise. He kissed her again when she looked up at him hopefully, still sniffing. Really? You promise? When he nodded, she gave a weak smile and blew her nose again. Relaxing back against him with a sigh, she gradually fell asleep, still wrapped in his arms. John arrived at his office just before 8 o'clock the next morning. He made a cup of tea and sat back in his chair, breathing in the soothing aroma and sorting through last night's conversation before he tackled the day's tasks. The coffee provided by the office manager was coarse, lacking the fresh aroma and smooth texture of American coffee. But the local tea had become an essential comfort, the only way he could relax in the office. He stared out of his window at the cooling tower, the center of the facility and the tallest building in sight. It dwarfed the reactor, looking in the bright sunlight like a graceful woman holding a shimmering ivory ball. He had to admit, it was one of the most visually appealing projects he'd found in the industry. Beyond the promise of cheap power for a struggling country, the modern technology was an appealing contrast to the surrounding traditional architecture. As he had many times before, he murmured, "I must take some photos before I leave this place." Smoke from the cooling tower billowed into the startling blue sky, for a moment reminding him of the crushing blast and sickening mushroom-like cloud of a nuclear explosion. He shook the thought off immediately. It was still a miracle, John thought, that the reactor had no major accidents, or, as far as he knew, even been shut down since it was activated. He looked around the cramped office, shared with two key Pakistan scientists, thinking about the country and the people. Pakistan boasted a high-enriched uranium reactor from the United States, a Canadian pressurized heavy water reactor, and its own indigenous reactors, along with a few uranium mines that could produce the concentrated yellow cake. It had covered virtually every aspect of the nuclear industry, not far behind Western countries. It was an undeniable achievement for such an underprivileged country. Still, Marian's caustic words flashed through his mind repeatedly, forcing him to question his own actions. What should be prioritized? Nuclear power or better standards of living? What was the best energy option for a poor country? With Pakistan's untapped resources of coal, oil, natural gases, and renewable energy, why go nuclear? Hanif, his Pakistani counterpart, interrupted his thoughts, dropping a file on his desk. With downcast eyes, he said, "I checked again and again, but I can't find where that missing 50 kilos of high-enriched uranium from America went. Every shipment looks correct for the last 24 hours. John frowned at the file. This is a very serious issue that can't be ignored. I have to report the missing shipment to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. I'm sorry, this is my fault." Hanif picked up the folder and flipped some pages, his brow furrowed. "I must have missed something. I'll go through it again." "We've both checked, and you've already spent more than a month trying to find the discrepancy. Something has to be wrong. Imagine if that uranium ends up in the hands of some irresponsible people or organizations. Just think what could happen." "It won't happen. I always check our inventory thoroughly. If another laboratory borrows the fuel rods, I always make sure they return the spent fuel." Hanif tried to defend himself. John looked up at Hanif in startled disbelief. "You lent fuel rods out to other laboratories? Which ones?" Hanif hesitated barely a second, his denial quick and sure. No, of course not. I would never do that. I only want to show how seriously I take my responsibility." His bushy eyebrows tilted up, and his dark eyes bulged, focusing on John indignantly. John stared at Hanif, dismay clouding his face. Generally, he enjoyed working with him, always laughed at the man's eccentric, colorful jokes. But this was serious. Was Hanif trying to cover something up? He drummed his fingers on the desk. "Hanif, please tell me, is nuclear technology essential to your country?" "Of course," Hanif huffed, clearly offended at the question. John held his palm out. "Let me finish, please. Nuclear power requires many resources, both financial and natural, plus high standards of research and management. I'm not sure your country is ready to handle it yet. For the last 10 years, your government has invested millions of dollars on nuclear energy, not to mention all the support from the West. Yet this project only makes up 1% of your total energy consumption. and we have seen virtually no relief where the power shortages are concerned. Meanwhile, people's living standards have seen next to no improvement. Maybe Pakistan should concentrate on improving people's living conditions first, and develop nuclear technology later, when more resources are available for it. Our base is very low, yes, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue nuclear energy. Please don't take this the wrong way. Pakistan is a sovereign country, and you're entitled to do what you think best. I'm just concerned about your people. Hanif nodded, accepting John's apology, though his eyes still flickered with anger. My point is that, compared with other forms of energy, nuclear is far more expensive and dangerous and takes longer to produce. Your uranium is limited, but you have plenty of coal and sun. Fossil fuels and solar energy are reasonable choices for you. The uranium resource issue will be resolved soon. I have a friend at the other nuclear laboratory who told me they are experimenting with how to produce high-enriched uranium and extract uranium from spent fuel. Once we achieve that, we won't need to import it from America anymore. Oh? John paused. But you'll still need to import heavy water from Canada. Maybe we could also produce heavy water ourselves. That would drag your economy down even further. John shook his head. It seems there's no end once you embark on the nuclear road. Well, we have to catch up with the West. Hanif shrugged and turned back to his desk, ending the conversation. John blew a few tea leaves away from the edge of his cup and took a sip. He realized now it was a waste of time to bring the topic up with Hanif. The scientists here were no different from any others, full of enthusiasm and sincerity for their research and invention. They had limited political experience and ignored any concerns about worldwide nuclear safety, or even their own country's well-being.